We have a pretty short lecture today since it's before Thanksgiving. We're going to cover three quick areas as far as the world influence that's happening on U.S. soil during this time period of history. We're going to talk about Mexico and then some other areas in South America area, Alaska and Hawaii, and then we're going to be done. So let's jump in. Let's start talking about Mexico. We've got to back up for 1 second, though. We need to come back or back up for a little bit and talk about something called the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, President Monroe proclaimed or put into place this thing that we call the Monroe Doctrine. And basically, the Monroe Doctrine said that the United States, here's like the technical textbook answer. The United States would oppose any European interference in the affairs of independent Latin American nations. So basically, what we said was, we have this land that's kind of bordering the United States, and that we will not interfere with any settlement below that border that's there, as long as nothing is happening there that will bother us. Basically, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. However, you need to understand that if you begin to interfere with us, or there is a thought that you might begin to interfere with the United States, at that point then action will be taken. So this was put into place quite a long time ago, 1823, and really the Monroe Doctrine went virtually unchallenged until the Civil War hit. So 1860s, we're going through the Civil War, and internally, as far as within the United States on our own, you know, we're this divided nation, and we become unable to do a lot of things outside of our own borders because we're fighting each other, right? And so what happens is you have this guy, Napoleon III, who, while America is preoccupied with the Civil War, this Emperor Napoleon III of France begins to take advantage of this situation, and he sends this guy, and he was an archduke, and his name genuinely was Maximilian. So Archduke Maximilian of Austria is sent into the French Empire that's set up in Mexico with an army of French troops. Now, while the war is happening, America really can only kind of protest the French occupation of Mexico. We can't do much about it. Again, we're fighting ourselves internally. However, once the war is over, the United States can now look outside of our own borders. And so what happens is we send this large force of troops past the Mexican border. This guy named William Seward, and we're going to hear his name later, goes with him, and he begins to demand that the French begin to withdraw their troops. And that the reason that this kind of falls under the Monroe Doctrine is that there's this line that has been drawn, and the concern is that if they begin to take over, there's going to be problems within the United States. So William Seward demands the French withdraw their troops. Now, at the same time, Napoleon is facing his own political problems inside of Europe. Excuse me. At the time, he really has no other option to withdraw his troops from Mexico. Archduke Maximilian, however, thinks that he has the support of many of the Mexican people. He by himself tries to continue his rule of Mexico without the aid of France behind him, and it does not work well for him. Eventually, he is executed because they view him trying to take over their country. Now, the United States doesn't actually sort of mention the Monroe Doctrine, and you begin to study history during this incident, but that principle is laid out here that, again, we're going to stay out of your business outside of our borders, but you begin to infringe on our space, and things are going to happen. So there is this sort of protection there of Mexico from France. The first mention of Napoleon going to play a big part in a little bit, and William Seward, we'll see his name again in a bit. We're going to sort of stick England in here for just a minute, because ultimately this is going to lead to an issue on the Venezuela side of things. We have to sort of add a little bit of a backstory here. Okay, so in the late 19th century, what we end up, several important things happen, which ultimately go back to this underlying thing that we just talked about, the Monroe Doctrine. And in the end, it ends up strengthening this bond between the United States and Great Britain. Now, historically, obviously, we fought the Revolutionary War, which sort of, well, not sort of, but obviously that doesn't leave England and the United States with a fantastic relationship. But we know that by the time World War I hits, that we are tight allies with Britain. And so with this time period, there are these things that happen that strengthen this bond between the United States and Great Britain. But before we get there, there's some controversy. And so we have this sort of first controversy with Britain. And it's involving this ship called the Alabama. So the Alabama and a couple of other British-built ships had been used by the Confederacy during the United States. So remember, the Union is the North, they're the winners. The Confederacy is the South, they're the losers. And there had been British-built ships used by the Confederacy during the Civil War, which ultimately caused heavy blows to the Union. So, after the war, the United States demanded that Britain pay for the damages done by these ships. Direct damages were estimated by the Secretary of State, who was William Seward, to be about $9 million. Now, $9 million today is a lot of money. I have no idea. I should have looked it up how much it was during this time period, but it would be a lot. Some Americans, however, insisted, and I can't really wrap my head around this, but they insisted that the British should pay a whole lot more for indirect losses, because their argument was based on the theory that Britain's failure to remain neutral, or Britain's failure to just sort of stay completely out of the war, prolonged the conflict, and therefore there were more damages done. So it kind of, in my opinion, seems like a long shot, but it is what it is. Now, 1871, the United States and Britain entered into this thing that's called the Treaty of Washington. By terms of this treaty, British expressed, and it's funny because they never really fessed up to giving the Confederacy ships, but they used this word escape. So basically they expressed their regret for the escape of ships into the Confederate hands. That they didn't really necessarily mean for them to have those ships, they just sort of escaped from their control. And then they agreed to submit this thing that's called arbitration, which is this settlement of a dispute by a person or person. So anyway, there's a court held, and a special court of arbitration meets and awards the United States $15.5 million in damages because of the ships that escaped into the hands of the Confederates. So we now end up with this thing called the Venezuelan boundary dispute. It happens in the late 18th century, or the late 1800s, I'm sorry. And there was this dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain, and it leads the United States to, again, enforce this Monroe Doctrine. So basically, there's this wilderness boundary between Venezuela and an area called British Guiana. And it wasn't necessarily a set in stone border, and there had been this dispute between this boundary for a very, very long time. And it really hasn't been a huge issue, but gold is discovered. And if we know anything from studying history, when gold is discovered, things go crazy. So gold is discovered, and what begins to happen is, because this boundary wasn't set in stone, Both sides begin to say the land is theirs, and therefore the gold is theirs. Several times the United States offered to serve as like a mediator in this situation. In 1895, the president was Grover Cleveland, and he was convinced that Venezuela, that their cause was just, that the Venezuelan border, they were the ones who are in the right. So he sends a guy named Richard Olney to send a message to Britain insisting that they submit the situation to someone outside to make an outside ruling. He informed the British authorities the United States considered Britain's claim to more land than she deserved to be a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, he said the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and he threatened to take action to see that the Monroe Doctrine was enforced. Long story short, we end up with 1877. Two countries established their own boundary line. It ended totally fine. And this peaceful settlement of the Alabama and the Venezuela boundary dispute was important because it kind of demonstrated the growing strength of the United States in international affairs. We had not been this super strong country, and then we had this civil war, and then we're able to step up in these two situations and show ourselves as a strong, standalone country who was able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine against Britain, and the respect is there, and this understanding that we're not going to be walked on comes into play. Okay, let's talk about more in Latin America. The first thing I want to talk about is an issue in Chile. So in 1891, U.S. officials were hesitant to recognize this revolutionary government which took power in Chile. And it was kind of this guerrilla warfare and this kind of very ugly new government that took power, and the United States sort of refused, because of the way it was put into place, to recognize it. Therefore, the Chilean government was upset because the United States refused to sell them any weapons. And it was fine until U.S. sailors aboard, there was a ship called the USS Baltimore, and there was a group of sailors who ended up docking in Chile. They were on leave, so they were off of the boat into the Chilean area, that's how you say it. They were attacked by citizens there. 2 sailors were killed, 18 of them were injured. Now, this is never good. It's never good in history when someone injures an American citizen on their soil. And so obviously this is not settled well. Harrison is president. He begins to demand that Chile provide, and this is a quote, prompt and full reparation. Now, I'm not exactly sure how you can pay for the death of someone, but he begins to demand that they take action, that they do something. So they demand, the American citizens, through President Harrison, demands that they make prompt and full reparation. The Chilean government refuses, which is not a big shocker. And basically, President Harrison suggests that Congress declare war and sends a squadron of 8 cruisers. Now, this is a pretty big deal. 8 big ships into the Pacific Ocean. When that begins to happen, Chile changes their minds. They agree to apologize. They decide to pay damages to the family of the killed and the wounded soldiers. All right, another thing we need to talk about is this thing called the Pan American Conference. So you have this guy whose name is James G. Blaine, and he was Secretary of State twice, and he was kind of especially interested in building cordial relationships with Latin America. And he calls a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1889. Delegates from the United States and Latin American nations come together. They begin to discuss different ways to promote peaceful relationships. And one of the big things was settling differences by having someone external come in and be the voice to settle those disputes. Now, the most significant result of this conference was an organization of what's called the International Bureau of American Republics. And in 1910, that organization became what we know as the Pan-American Union. And it has permanent headquarters in Washington, D.C. And the purpose of the Pan-American Union is to really work towards promoting understanding and friendly relationships, cooperation basically, among all of these republics, so that we can have a peaceful relationship with all of these countries in Latin America. Let's talk quickly about Alaska. All right. During the latter part of the 19th century, we sort of have this idea of national expansion. We want to grow as a nation. Kind of hit the high in the early 1940s. Was still a pretty big desire of the United States was to continue to grow during this time period. You have this guy named William Stewart. He was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and under Johnson. And this guy specifically really wanted to see the United States expand beyond its borders. So when Russia expressed the interest of dropping their possession of this area in northwest Canada, William Seward, Secretary of State, quickly drew up a treaty that would allow him to purchase what we now call Alaska for $7,200,000, which is an exorbitant amount of money, but especially that time period, it's a huge amount of money. However, many Americans were not convinced that buying this, wilderness region that was super far north, it's this frozen, in many people's eyes, wasteland, and they kind of began to make fun of it. They called it Seward's Folly, and folly is a word for joke, or Seward's Icebox, that it was just this waste of American time and money, that it was a waste of time. So in 1867, though, the Senate, because of Seward just persisting and pushing and pushing and pushing, the Senate ratified a treaty in 1867. Now, 1867, we are allowed, I'm sorry, I got my brain shut down for a second. It wasn't until later that we began to really realize the full value of this purchase of Alaska. So not only did it remove another European power super close to us, I mean, think about the difference in World War I and in World War II if Russia had still owned that land so close to us. So it removed this northern power from the hemisphere, but it added from the western hemisphere. It added 600,000 square miles of land to the United States. What we didn't know at the time, I think that William Seward probably had a very good indication of it, but I don't think the rest of America did. These natural resources, the fishing there, the fur, the trade, the timber, coal, gold, oil, these natural gases that are there. It's really just 50 miles across the Bering Strait from Russia, and it became a massive help in the United States defense, especially during the wars. And in 1959, Alaska becomes the 49th state to join the United States. It was the first new state in 47 years. When the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, the boundary between Alaska and Canada was not completely definitely determined. In 1897, gold is discovered in Klondike, and of course we know that gold discovery makes things go crazy, and so it was really crucial that we get that line in place. And in 1903, we end up with a fixed boundary between the United States, Canada, and Great Britain kind of aids us in that. And that's how Alaska becomes our 49th state. Let's talk about a little area called the American Samoa. So about 5,000 miles southwest of California is a little section of islands called Samoa. And In 1870s, I believe, America arranged to establish a coaling station. So we had steam-powered like ships, and there was an area in this Samoan Islands that America had arranged to put a coaling station so the ships could stop and restock their coal. Germany and England were also interested in this area, and the three nations, the United States, England, and Germany, made an informal agreement of joint supervision of the islands. However, if we know much about Germany, didn't really go over so well. And within a few years, Germany tried to take complete control of the Samoan Islands. The three nations sent warships to the area to protect their interests there. And in 1889, German and American ships were just about to start a battle when an unexpected hurricane destroyed all the warships except one British vessel. It was able to sort of turn around and sort of steam out of the area just in the nick of time. So war was avoided. In the spring of 1889, diplomats came together from the three countries. They grew up an official agreement for joint protectorate, is what it's called, of the island. So prior to this, it was not an official agreement. It was just sort of this understood thing. I haven't put all this up there. So the arrangement proved itself to be unsuccessful. In 1899, it was joint possession was totally abandoned. England gave up all claims, and in exchange was given territory in Africa, and in another set of islands called the Solomon Islands. The United States was granted control of one main area and then several smaller islands, while Germany controlled the rest of the Samoan Islands until, I believe it was World War I. At that point, New Zealand took control of them, and ultimately there was a place, and I'm not sure I'm saying this right, Tutuila became one of the first U.S. possessions outside of the North American continent. Today, this area and the neighboring islands are controlled by the United States. There's a section of them called American Samoa. Let's talk about Hawaii. Now, you have this guy called Captain James Cook, and technically, textbooks are going to tell you that the Hawaiian Islands were discovered in 1778 by this English explorer, Captain James Cook. The reality is, for decades, English and American explorers, trappers, whalers had stopped there for food and supplies on their way from China. In 1820, we have Christian missionaries go over. And in 1875, the United States and Hawaii enter into what's called a reciprocal trade agreement. And basically, it's a trade agreement that both parties are going to benefit from. And in 1887, this charter, or this agreement, was renewed. And at that time, we were allowed to put a Navy base on the Hawaiian Islands, which is Pearl Harbor, which we will see that name again. And today it's very well known for the bombing of Pearl Harbor that sort of catapulted us into World War II. Now, in 1891, and I should have put a picture on here of her, Queen, let me see if I can say this right, hold on, I can say it when I read it, so let me look at it. Le'ieokalani, I believe is how you say her name. And she becomes the Queen of Hawaii. She absolutely 100% disapproves of the influence the white settlers are having on the islanders. She comes to the throne, she becomes queen, and she had a tagline. Her tagline was Hawaii for the Hawaiians. And basically, it starts this movement in which she begins to increase her power beyond, in all honesty, beyond those limits that were set by the Hawaiian Constitution. So the Constitution, there was a Hawaiian Constitution in place that gave their monarch certain rules and parameters that they were allowed to rule in. When she becomes queen, she begins to just do exactly what she wants. And as a result of this, some Americans on the island started to a movement to remove this lady from power and to establish a temporary government. Obviously, it wasn't good for the Americans who were there because she didn't want any white people there. But at the same time, you have this ruler coming in and stepping outside of the legal boundaries that were in that area. So you have some understanding that it wasn't just about the way the Americans were being treated, but it was also about the way the Hawaiians were being treated because she was so overstepping her boundaries. President Cleveland took office for his second term in 1893, and there was a treaty put in place. Anyway, it was just this big mess. There was a 1898. You have this Spanish-American War, which we will discuss next time, breaks out. The Hawaii Islands are annexed to the United States, so they're sort of put under the power of the United States. And in 1900, Hawaii was granted territorial status, and its people became U.S. citizens. So when we have a territory, the people become U.S. citizens. Hawaii begins to prosper as a territory of the United States, and ultimately, on August 21st of 1959, that date should have been written there, but 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state. You guys have a homework quiz online. The link should have been directly under this video link. And everything you need to answer those questions should come straight from this lecture.